Unfortunately, I can't change anything now. I'm dead as a prisoner. In a statement to the jury, he said, "I'm sorry from the bottom of details from the UK end up how it was a monster."
It comforts and protects us to think that people that are capable of these terrible deeds are aliens, are a species apart.
The US House of Representatives has voted to impose a 90% tax on bonus in our monetary crystal after the BBC News from David Mine.
But in a real prison.
Unfortunately, I can't change anything now. I'm dead as a prisoner. In a statement to the jury, he said, "I'm sorry from the bottom of my heart. Unfortunately, I can't change anything now." In his hometown, people said they were satisfied that at last justice had been done.
He can't be killed, but solitary confinement or something like that. He should be locked up, exactly as his victims were.
I think it's certainly just that he's been locked up for life. Anything else would have surprised me. I think it's fine. It fits.
I would lock him in a cellar until the end of his life. That way he can have some kind of idea of what it was like.
He's an actor. He's been trying to worm his way out of it. I don't think much of a life sentence. He's a monster, a devil, everything. There's no word for it.
24 years? He should just be locked away. Not in a mental institution, but in a real prison.
Well, the trial of Josef Fritzl lasted less than 4 days. When the videotaped evidence of his daughter was shown, the public and the press were excluded from the courtroom. But today, as the verdict and the sentence were announced, they were allowed in, among them Kate Connolly of The Guardian.
The head of the jury announced the verdicts and the sentencing, and Josef Fritzl appeared very composed. All we saw was his legs slightly shaking, his head moving a little bit from side to side, but he sat very still and composed as the verdict was announced.
There was no doubt, of course, really, about the verdict, given that he had already, as of yesterday morning, pleaded guilty to all of the charges.
That's right, but the sticking point of this whole trial has been the murder charge through neglect of a child born in 1996, a twin born to his daughter Elizabeth, and the prosecution was arguing throughout the trial that his failure to get medical help for that child led to his death. The fact that there was no corpse, that he had apparently burnt the body of the child in an incinerator in the backyard, and it was really Elizabeth's word against his. A lot of legal experts said that it was going to be very, very difficult to prove that charge, but when the verdict came through from the jury, it was clear that that was going to be the charge that would send him down for life. What we then later heard in a very dramatic summary by his lawyer, Rudolf Meyer, was that the reason for Elizabeth had been very, very important for her to come to court to give testimony. She gave testimony on a video screen, a video link-up that was pre-recorded, but she also was in person in court on Tuesday, and we believe that this was what led to his very surprised confession that he had turned around and had seen his daughter in court. It was the first encounter between the two since her escape from the dungeon prison last April, and he had been weeping watching the evidence and had apparently then later confessed in his prison cell.
And I gather there now also has been a statement from him expressing sorrow, regret and remorse.
That's right. He said, "I deeply regret from the bottom of my heart the damage that I have done to my family," and he said that he would do everything he could to try and limit that damage. We understood that, after speaking to his lawyer, we understood that that meant that he would hope to get some financial compensation for them. We don't know how that will work out because he has various properties, but there are bankruptcy proceedings that have been launched against him. There is, of course, the house, which has been nicknamed the House of Horrors, where these crimes took place. We understand that local authorities are planning to buy that house, which is worth some €350,000, and bulldoze it. The town, it seems, is hoping that that will actually happen so that they can move on and hopefully shake off the title of the monster town.
Kate Connolly of The Guardian. Well, this has been one of those cases that's been followed around the world. It seems that wherever we live, we are fascinated by the terrible excesses that some of us are capable of. But is that fascination something to be ashamed of? Does it stem from unhealthy prurience? Or is it because we want to understand our fellow humans, even those responsible for appalling crimes? The Reverend George Pitcher is religion editor at the Daily Telegraph. Professor David Cantor is director of the Centre for Investigative Psychology at Liverpool University. I asked George Pitcher if he thinks that our interest in these crimes is something that we should be ashamed of.
I think we need to recognise that we share a common humanity with him, because my concern is that when we bandy about words that trip off the tongue rather too easily, like evil and wicked, what we might be trying to do is to objectify Joseph Fritzl and people like him who commit heinous crimes, as if to separate them from the rest of humanity, as if it comforts and protects us to think that people that are capable of these terrible deeds are aliens, are a species apart, and of course that's not the case.
David Cantor, how do you explain, as a psychologist, the fascination that crimes such as those committed by Joseph Fritzl have for most other people?
I think it's a very healthy response to trying to understand what it means to be human. I think people want to try and get to grips with how individuals like this can do something that seems to be so beyond the edge of any sort of acceptable human behaviour, and still apparently seem to be people who function quite normally in society.
That perhaps is part of the fascination, that they seem so ordinary, and yet what they do is so far from ordinary.
That's right, and it's an attempt to understand that, because of course that's much more worrying, the idea that somebody walking down the street who doesn't look like a monster or doesn't look like they're possessed by the devil or whatever, that these individuals actually have committed and can commit things that are so horrific. And I think this is one of the issues that emerges and in the discussions about Joseph Fritzl, is the idea that somehow that we can explain and almost try to suggest that it's not really his fault, that he has some sort of a psychiatric or psychological problem. And I'm totally against that notion that somehow or other, I mean, the discussions in the press at the moment suggesting, for instance, that it's really his mother's fault, rather than this being a choice he has made that really does demonstrate his ability to understand what he was doing and to create a world for himself that is one in which he will live out these ideas of how he wants to abuse and take advantage of other people, and in this case of his own daughter and the children that she gave birth to.
I'm interested that you use a phrase like the choice he has made, and I want to come back to that. But first to George Pitcher, you talked about common humanity. What do I have in common with Joseph Fritzl, apart from the obvious fact that we're all members of the human race?
Well, I think that's fundamental to it. We share a humanity with him. I do indeed believe that people are entirely culpable for their own actions in the overwhelming majority of cases.
You think this is a choice that is made
Yes.
by a bad person?
People make conscious decisions with their free will as to how to behave. Now, I, as a clergyman, am going to take the view that we are also given tremendous freedom that goes with that. The human being is an enormously wonderful and complex creature with enormous potency and capacity for infinite abilities of love and the doing of good. Now, we do have freedom to turn away from that fount of good, and we as creatures are able then to pervert that potency into the most awful darkness.
David Cantor, you said he made a choice. We make a choice as to whether to read about what he did, to listen to reports of what he did. Do our choices reflect something about what kind of a person we are?
Of course they do. In fact, you could argue that the choices we make define the sort of person we are. And what's really interesting is the way in which the church, in the views that have just been expressed, is now embracing what would be regarded as a relatively conventional psychological perspective. Of course, in the past, the church said that people who committed these terrible deeds were possessed by something that was not human. Now the church has really seen what really is, I think, the major discovery of modern psychology, is that human beings are very varied. They extend to the outer limits of brilliance and of great significance, and to the outer limits of doing what really, I think evil is a perfectly good term for describing
You're
how
happy with the term
heretic.
evil, are you? I mean, you happy to use a term like that?
I'm very happy with the term evil to describe people who very consciously and deliberately over a very long period of time abuse